Welcome back, guys, to the JPS podcast, and we are here with Brandon Kempter. Brandon, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on. Do appreciate it.
Pleasure, man. And we are talking about carbohydrates today. We had the privilege of having Brandon here in Melbourne presenting last weekend at the Ultimate Physique Conference. Brandon is a well-renowned bodybuilder and coach and works with a lot of elite level physique guys and gals. So we're going to be discussing the role of carbohydrates and how we can better understand them for the purpose of maximizing our body composition and performance. So Brando, we'll kick things off with the fundamentals around carbohydrates. What is the role of carbohydrates in the body?
Yeah, look, carbohydrate is the primary energy substrate for the body. Obviously, if carbohydrates are scant, we do have mechanisms by which we can essentially keep the body fueled, whether it be through ketones for keeping the brain functioning or gluconeogenesis. Uh, but carbohydrate is, of course, of particular importance for resistance-based athletes, given that glycolytic metabolism predominates ATP synthesis. So for us, carbohydrates are, an important driver for facilitating performance, which makes way for stimulus accrual, which obviously upregulates the signaling pathways associated with growth. Um, so it's sort of like the backbone for us, and within general performance-based nutrition for the glycolytic dominant athlete, we should have carbohydrate predominate calorie provision. We're focusing on sufficient protein sufficiency, fat sufficiency, and allocating as much of our calorie aliquot towards carbohydrate as possible in the constraints for energy budget in both the dieting condition and whether we're eucaloric or in a surplus.
Yeah, awesome, awesome. So let's start with when we're in a surplus. How important are carbohydrates when we're in a surplus? And I guess what is the order of importance when it comes to the ins and outs of carbohydrates? So total intake versus timing versus the type of carbohydrate. Let's start to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. So, look, in the context of gaining phase or a deficit, carbohydrate remains, a centerpiece of importance. We could argue that maybe in a deficit, the specific macronutrient distribution becomes a little bit more important as the energy intake is not conducive to optimizing performance. But in any case, it should be emphasized even in the gaining phase. And obviously, when it comes to our macronutrients, we're going to look at it in terms of dose, type, and timing. They're your big sort of factors we'll evaluate. Number one is obviously the dose of which we're consuming within a given time frame. We usually use a 24-hour period. It's just the most simplistic to work with. And then above and beyond that, obviously, we can look at our type and timing. So for timing, I will mention the importance of meal timing. Timing is obviously in reference to, well, consuming, in this case, carbohydrates in reference to a event. In our scenario, it's going to be training. Uh, the importance of meal timing likely increases the lower energy intake is. So in a gaining phase, for example, where carbohydrate is abundant, we can probably pluck you out from whatever you're doing, and your muscle glycogen saturation will be in a position to perform and perform pretty well. But that can't be said when you're dieting in basal muscle glycogen saturation is lower. Therefore, timing becomes more important so you can acutely fuel your training bout. But in any case, it's good to have good practices in place in a gaining phase. That has transferability to the dieting phase as well. So for timing, uh, well, number one for priority in the pre-training window is going to be carbohydrate, fuel the training first. Obviously, there's benefit consuming protein there as well. And post-training, your number one priority is going to be, well, protein followed by carbohydrate. But there is benefit. This is where people get this a little bit twisted. Is in the post training window, there is benefit in consuming carbohydrate. Maybe the insulinemic response is a benefit in reducing catabolism post-training because training itself is actually catabolic. It's the increase in cellular signaling after that precipitates the anabolic processes. But above and beyond that, supporting the energetically costly process of muscle protein synthesis, offers us benefit for net protein accrual as well. So broadly speaking, I believe current evidence-based recommendations are somewhere in the realms of, a gram or more per kilo body mass uh, consumed, pre and post training. Um, I will mention there is potential benefit mechanistically with consuming carbohydrate intra-training as well. The benefit of which is again likely increased in the dieting condition. And if we look at resistance-based athletes, there's a paper that comes to mind, a 2020 paper looking at maltodextrin supplementation on markers for performance in resistance-based athletes. It actually was not statistically significant. Um, however, these individuals were at maintenance. So we know that consuming, oh, we know that even when muscle glycogen saturation is low, even rinsing the mouth with carbohydrate and spitting it out seems to offer benefit. Um, Not to go off on a tangent, but obviously there's a decrease in central drive associated with operating with low basal muscle glycogen saturation. Stimulating oral receptors in the mouth seems to delimit the central nervous system. So in the dieting condition, even doing that is great if you want to give yourself an eating disorder, but there's probably benefit in consuming it as well. And from a prophylactic perspective, in the context of an off season, I very frequently advocate for the use of intra-workout carbohydrate, but not to the doses at which an endurance athlete would consume it. They're looking at like up to 90 grams per hour using multi-transport carbohydrate. So not to shift the osmolality in the GI tract, precipitate GI perturbation. We're looking at like zero point 0.5 to 1 gram per kilo. Um, well, zero point 0.5 to a maximum 1 gram per kilo in the intra-training window, usually, generally, not exceeding 60 grams. So for me, I'm running like up to 60 grams in a training session at the end of a off season, which is down to like 0.7 or so. Um, so yes, broad recommendations. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure. I
Yeah,
apologize.
no, that
Expanded.
definitely did. Okay, so let's talk about what that might look like. So for someone who is in the off season, intra workout, what kind of carbohydrates are you consuming? Are you having just a Gatorade, or is there a specific type of carbohydrate that you're consuming during your workouts?
Yes, I actually didn't actually talk about type even in the pre-training window, but for intra-training, we want something that is fast digesting. So usually it's going to be sucrose, glucose, or maltodextrin. They're good candidates. Um, there is a logical basis for incorporating multi-transport carbohydrates. So, as I'm sure many of your listeners would be aware, glucose and fructose is transported through the intestinal lumen by divergent methods. Glucose through active transport, and then fructose through passive means, so a much slower rate. But if you want to maximize net carbohydrate uptake, well, then you're going to use both. And that's important if you are an endurance athlete because the rate limiting factor in endurance athletes is carbohydrate availability. And they're often burning through carbohydrate at a rate of which uh, is challenging to replenish. So, and usually the general ceiling is around 60 grams per hour is what we usually refer to for glucose uptake. So when you go above that, which is highly unlikely in the context of resistance-based athlete, well, then you would use fructose and use a combination, use like dextrose, maltose, and fructose. Mixed with a lot of fluid, so not to shift the osmolality in the gastrointestinal tract, because that can precipitate diarrhea. It's one of the reasons you see endurance athletes who suffer from this unfortunate consequence. But for us, the doses that we're using pretty low. So sucrose, malto, or dextrose. Dextrose is pure glucose. It's very sweet. Sucrose is sugar, so that's going to be present. You could have lolly snakes, for example. Lollies. Gatorade is great because you're going to hydrate and you're going to provide electrolytes. The electrolytes will obviously promote hydration, replace what you're losing through dermal losses. Um, and maltodextrin is not overly sweet, so that can be a benefit if you're just not someone that enjoys that sweet taste. But long story short, Gatorade's a good candidate. Sure.
Very good, very good. And what about during a contest prep? So run me through your process for decreasing calorie intake during a contest prep. Obviously, I know how much of a fan you are of keeping carbohydrates as high as possible for as long as possible, but there is obviously a point where carbohydrates are going to get uncomfortably low
Yeah.
for most people anyway. So run me through what that might look like, Brenda.
Yeah. Look, the challenging thing in contest prep is, well, we do need to reduce energy intake, maybe increase energy expenditure in order to facilitate fat loss, right? Certain things we need to do. And in such a scenario, it really comes down to managing your timeline and doing what you can to facilitate, or better said, as I often put forth, every phase has function, every phase has trade-off. That's probably a good way to start. In contest prep, the function is fat loss. The trade-off is there is a possibility for performance degradation and subsequently possibly muscle loss. So what are you going to do to manage that? There's a variety of things we can do in terms of managing the timeline, which allows us to diet less aggressively. But in any case, you're going to be in an energy deficit. You got to pull your energy from somewhere. And carbohydrate is the only non-essential macronutrient. You can survive with no carbohydrate. You're not going to thrive, but you can survive. You cannot survive for a great deal of time with no protein or no fats. They have other essential roles. So with that in mind, you could argue that just pulling solely from carbohydrates is the way to go. Uh, and whether you like it or not, you have to pull from that area. But I would encourage and really emphasizing protein sufficiency, uh, fat sufficiency, and allocating as much carbohydrate as possible in order to bolster your training performance. And it's your training performance that's going to persuade the body to liberate energy from adipose tissues and preserve subsequently muscle mass. So I am quite fond of pulling fats down to a degree, keeping in mind that it's important for ADEK absorption, synthesis of steroid-based hormones, etc. Usually, our sort of baseline limit would be somewhere around 0.5 grams per kilo is kind of the floor. And one of the things you'll consider there is how low, like how long you run that for. Uh, so yes, carbohydrate has to come down no matter what you do, but you may choose to pull that lever in terms of pulling down fats a little bit as well. Within that phase, I do still like to incorporate intra-workout carbohydrate. Practically speaking, it's hard to psychologically rationalize it,
Mm.
but the performance benefit is probably more pronounced through that time. Mechanistically, it
Is that
makes
an every
sense.
workout thing, or is that okay, we're only going to do that on the days which are your hardest workouts, say a leg session or rotating it every now and then, or is that you've got to do this every workout?
How many easy sessions do you
What's the BK method?
how many easy sessions do you have in contest prep? What are you talking
Well, none of
about?
them are using contest prep. Good point, but some are certainly harder than others.
Agreed. Look, the way I like to view it is, I mean, look, we may reduce intra-workout carbohydrate as well,
Yeah.
but in the majority of cases, we're going to keep it in place. Now, I don't like to be dogmatic with my approach. There are occasions where it's just you have an individual who has to dig very hard, and it's nonsensical to take 15 grams of carbohydrate run intra training when they're running on 100 grams of carbs. That'd be very tough. But in the majority of cases, it remains an inclusion. And the way I look at it is that, let's say you got 150 grams of carbohydrate, you're dieting really aggressive, right? And there's 15 grams intra training. Mentally, I need you to think there's 135 grams of carbs. Don't even worry about the 15. That's a staple piece. You've psychologically compartmentalized it. It's part of what you do. Move on. Uh, and generally speaking, it'll be a staple throughout.
Yeah.
Um,
So you set that habit up early and then it just keeps continuing as the calories and carbohydrates get lower.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And obviously in a contest prep, there are occasions where we temporarily increase carbohydrate intake,
Mhm.
for the purpose of sustaining the diet, topping up glycogen stores and a bunch of other things, refeeds and diet breaks. Let's discuss, Brando, your approach and thoughts on the topic of refeeds and diet breaks when you're in an extended fat loss phase.
Yeah. Now, I will say the next stretch of time that I talk is primarily a product of sort of mechanistic, uh, having a mechanistic base and personal anecdote. Because as you're aware, the research doesn't really support the inclusion. Well, it's a bit mixed. Obviously, like Pios's paper really, his outcome measures showed essentially no difference between intermittent energy restriction versus continuous, with the exception of reductions in appetite. But there was that lovely paper, I think it was a 2020 post 2020 paper looking at intermittent energy restriction, 2 refeeds per week that actually showed an increase in lean mass retainment. I will say personally, again, I'm not dogmatic with my approach with athletes, but I am an advocate for intermittent energy restriction. Um, uh, the The rationale there is obviously topping up muscle glycogen saturation to protect training performance. There may be some benefit for appetite as well, but realistically, at the end of contest prep, you're hyperphagic no matter what you do. But I also believe there's benefit there in terms of the muscle volume that you yield, and that being potentially anti-catabolic in itself. There is a mechanistic basis for that. Furthermore, in the dieting condition, there is some pretty, particularly as you go from lean to very lean, some unfavorable changes to nutrient partitioning uh, in reference to both protein and carbohydrate. But it's plausible to assume you have a decrease in peripheral insulin sensitivity. It's like a bell-shaped curve. Like if you're fat, insulin sensitivity is no good. If you're healthy body composition, pretty good. And maybe it drops off at the back end. So there, I believe there's potential benefit in protecting peripheral nutrient partitioning capacity so that you can top up when you need to coming into the show. As I often say, get flat to get lean, flat to look lean. And broadly speaking, when we're looking at sort of like weekly nutrition periodization in the contest prep, oftentimes, not dogmatic here, it'll follow, we operate on sort of you deplete, so to speak, with the diet and nutrition. You're not carbohydrates as high as possible, whether you like it or not, muscle glycogen on
It's an
deplete.
organic depletion versus a deliberate, let's do
Yeah,
everything we can to deplete as quickly as possible. Yeah.
exactly right. But you deplete, replete, repeat.
Yeah.
That's the motto we have. Like, okay.
Yeah. Is that
And
occurring on a weekly, fortnightly, monthly basis? What's that look like for most of your athletes? Or what are the, I guess, factors to consider for the duration of the depletion versus repletion? Is it losing a certain amount of body weight? Is it a certain percentage of body fat that you're looking to see come off?
yeah, well, we'll usually use a 7 day period as like an
Yeah.
arbitrary volume of time for the sake of simplicity.
Yeah.
Uh, we oftentimes will partner that high day on a if they're training in the afternoon at least, we might partner it on a day of which is a weak point in their physique. If they're training first thing in the morning, we might do that the day before so that they have digested and assimilated the carbohydrate. We may put it, depending on the individual, as a floating refeed. So we kind of refeed like on a more sort of as needed basis. It's a little bit more intuitive. But in majority of scenarios, we'll fix it on a specific day and we'll evaluate the response from there. We can also use this as a means of evaluating the individual's response to a given dose of carbohydrate when it comes to peaking as well, which is super, super handy. Um, and oftentimes we'll base these refeed periods or repletion period, refeed period around energy maintenance and with carbohydrate predominating energy provision. And oftentimes we increase the frequency of which we do this, the deeper we get into prep, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive. But if you think logically, it's the process of going from lean to very lean, where you're in the most compromised position in reference to retaining muscle mass and where you need to manage fatigue more assertively.
And
And
also
if
a slower rate of loss is expected. So having fewer days, whether it's a week or over the month, in a deficit is probably advantageous.
Definitely. And that's what I was going to say. If you manage your timeline accordingly, and I presented this a little while back, the phasing approach to contest prep, you should be tapering your rate of loss at the end of your contest preparation, which affords you the ability to be more liberal with the inclusion of these repletion periods. So deplete, replete, repeat. Yeah.
Okay, awesome, awesome. And in terms of the foods that people are refeeding with, what's your approach there? Is obviously a lot of individualization that comes into this, but I'm sure it's mostly eating the same foods but more of them. However, there'd be situations where I'm sure you have athletes that are basically living on salad and green vegetables with, very small amounts of, like rice and potato here and there to sort of get their limited carbohydrate intake sorted. So, how do you go about the inclusion of new foods when somebody is getting close to stage? What are your recommendations there?
Yeah. I mean, usually if we're going to implement a repletion day, yeah, we keep things pretty similar in terms of food selections, increasing the quantities to meet the carbohydrate aliquot. In most scenarios, the majority of food selections the individual's consuming is minimally processed. That's great for obviously uh, ensuring they're getting their micronutrient requirements and keeping palatability low so we're not unnecessarily increasing hedonic appetite. Um, But yes, we do need to be cognizant if they're getting all their carbohydrate from lettuce, they're going to sit down and eat 6 kilos of lettuce. So usually we'll pay attention to their fiber intake, and we're usually going to opt for food selections of which are generally well tolerated, rice, potatoes, etc., as sort of the lever you pull for increasing carbohydrate. But there is occasions where that's not appropriate. For example, if you need to synthesize muscle glycogen at a very, very fast rate, you want to promote a hyperinsulinemic response, in which case the type of carbohydrate becomes, you know, a factor influencing this. So if we're doing, say, a 1 day carbohydrate load for a show, well, then we're not going to be loading on um, like brown rice. Like, no, I'm going to go for white rice. Probably going to go for cream of rice. I want a faster rate of digestion with lower residue in the GI tract. So in that scenario, we're going to make some changes. But I will say that one one thing, one something I have recognized that some individuals do that makes their life harder is in the absence of requiring a very fast rate of glycogen synthesis, is incorporating hyperpalatable foods on their refeed day. Oh, I've got a bit more carbohydrate. Let me put a Mars bar in here. You already know that food reward sensitivity is going to be through the ceiling. So why capitalize on that further and reduce your food volume beyond what is necessary? It's going to make appetite much worse in the days proceeding. Um, so yeah, that's usually how we manage things. Even coming into the contest season, you mentioned like incorporating new foods. Uh, there are certain foods which are generally well tolerated. I haven't had rice in a while. You're probably going to be okay with tolerating that. Very well tolerated. I haven't had dairy in 6 months. Probably not a good idea to sink a kilo of Chobani yogurt a day before a show. So simplicity is a good idea, and not incorporating brand new food groups, broadly speaking, in close proximity to the show, particularly in high doses, would be advisable.
Yep. Awesome. And let's talk about, I guess, spilling over. This is one of the more dreaded outcomes that bodybuilders are concerned with, or even, individuals who are doing photo shoots and they want to fill up glycogen stores, then they look soft afterwards because they've eaten too much carbohydrate or haven't had enough time, to expel any, extracellular water. So let's talk about spilling over. What causes it, and then how do you, I guess, deal with that if it does happen? Yeah, and give us some stories as well, Brandon. Give us some personal anecdotes.
Yeah, I mean, look, spilling over is essentially, um, yes, when you consume carbohydrate to a point of which you have some shifts in osmotic gradients and you end up sort of holding fluid in unfavorable ways, which usually gives a bit of a hazy look to the physique, for lack of a better term. And I often observe that spilling occurs in one of two kind of ways. Either you have metaphorically filled up the cup that is muscle glycogen to the point at which it overflows, and obviously the body is too intelligent to, it's not going to just let that carbohydrate pass through the GI tract. No, we're going to store that. And you have a spill, in which case, correcting it requires you to pull carbohydrate down. And it can take, depending on how bad the spill is, it can take, anywhere from a few hours to, 2 or 3 days, depending on how, much you've overspilled. The other way you can kind of transiently spill is when your rate of carbohydrate consumption kind of exceeds your rate of synthesis. And I kind of analogize to like pouring water in a funnel. It's running out the bottom, filling up the metaphoric cup, but I'm just pouring in so quick that it's faster than the output, and then it overflows. And when you have that, it's pretty transient. It's like and that a couple hours later you're okay. The issue is, even if it's transient in nature, you're only on stage for a transient period of time. So if that occurs, then you're in trouble. Um, so I mean that's sort of spilling in a nutshell. But if you're managing your if you're paying attention to your refeed periods, you should have a good ballpark as to how the individual responds within their environment. Then you can use that as a reference point for evaluating your peaking strategy. But one of the things to consider is if you've tested it, like, yep, that's all good, you need to evaluate if there's changes in their environment. They're a tradie coming into peak week, having the week off, coach, expenditure goes down. The same given volume of carbohydrate will facilitate a divergent response. But in terms of stories, man, of yeah, we've definitely had some cool, I suppose you could say, corrections over time.
Love
Generally
time.
speaking, look, I will say this. Generally speaking, I'm a little bit on the conservative side. When it comes to peaking, flat generally correlates with tight. There are some instances where that doesn't occur. If you dehydrate, you generally have a flat look that is actually soft. That's a shite combination. Um, but or if you really tinker with your electrolytes in a crazy way. But generally speaking, tight. So flat is tight, and then you fill up and you stay. You get fuller, fuller, fuller. You stay tight, and then you get to a point where you're really full. And this is where you prop spilling over. You get full, and you sort of spill over. And usually that's characterized by just you can see the individual has a lot of muscle fullness. They pump up. They pump up super easily. They're usually very vascular as they're transporting this carbohydrate to the peripheral tissues, and they have that hazy kind of look. And within one of the peaking seminars I did a few years ago, I gave an example. I had an individual who spilt over hard in the first section of the week. Thankfully, this was front load, loading carbohydrate at the start of the week and then tapering down. And as we walked through his season, we'd walked up his carbohydrate, we'd go a little bit higher, a little bit higher. And I believe we stepped into this last peak week with a different level of basal muscle glycogen saturation, had some environmental changes. So basically, how empty the cup is determines how much carbohydrate you need to fill it. So we were starting with a half full cup. So the volume of carbohydrate that we loaded was, in light of that, not appropriate. And we spilled. And this individual, you could see it was night and day. But then we walked the carbohydrate down through the week, and he came in with a very nice tight look with an appropriate fullness. But that was an experience that required some rather substantial adjustments to the protocol, and that's really, and as a coach, as an athlete, you in a peaking scenario, you have to be quite open to change. It is a very iterative process.
And obviously, in situations where you don't have that kind of time to correct the physique and the look, in the case that you had a front load. So let's say you're backloading and you spill over. What do you do there, Brando? Like, what's your go-to method to try and like fix things as quickly as possible when time is not on your side?
Well, I mean, in that scenario there, assuming the spill is directly carbohydrate related, we're going to try, we'd pull carbohydrate to essentially nil if you've got, say, 10 hours, and we'd run up frequent pump ups, essentially burning through some of that carbohydrate. Um, and look, if it's a mild spill, like in an ideal world, you may even get like be really walking the line for spilling the night before a show if you're running a backload. So then you obviously have a rate of glucose um, burn per unit of time through basal metabolic processes. If you're right on the edge of spilling over the night before, you wake up in the morning tighter with a high degree of fullness, that's fine. But if you've taken many strides past that barrier, then yes, carbohydrate down, fluid intake, keep it in, pump, pump, pump. Like basically, I've had guys in the morning of a show be right on the edge, in which case basically it's on the hour, a 15-minute pump. Okay, have a look, cool, and titrate from there. And that's really all we can do. Um, and you can turn it around pretty quickly, depending on how bad you've spilt over. I mean, if you're like a watery mess, you might need a couple of days. But I highly doubt most individuals aren't doing that. Okay, let's load you on 15 grams per kilo carbohydrate the day before a show. It's illogical to do so.
Yeah. Brando, we've covered quite a lot, and I think the listeners will take plenty from that. Your knowledge and experience is second to none here, mate. Guys, thank you for listening. Brando, thank you, mate.
Thank you very much for having me. Do appreciate it.
And guys, make sure you check Brandon out. He's a wealth of knowledge, puts up plenty of good content, and definitely, if you're in need of a contest prep coach, he's your man.
Cheers.
All right, guys, we'll see you all next time.